I sense a very hip and deep spirit here tonight, and I think that's because of the musicians that we're going to have here. I am Larry Blumenfeld. This is a wonderful place, and they've allowed me and indulged me and supported me in this belief that we can gather around culture in a place called the museum, but it won't be the same preaching from on high, and that we'll be celebrating context and a living, multicultural experience of stories and points of view that change over time. So, years ago I did programs on New Orleans after the hurricane and a fight for culture, on Afro-Cuban tradition in New York. This particular series, Jazz and Social Justice, started in 2017. Somebody got elected then. Found myself out in the street. I realized we had a lot of different issues we wanted to talk about, and that there were a lot of musicians I knew who felt very strongly about this issue or that issue, and it had a lot to do with the art they create. So the idea here was an intimate salon of sorts, where you hear 30 minutes of music, and it's a drag to stop, and then we talk, but the talk gets really deep. In this particular case, you can go to Public Records in Brooklyn tomorrow night and hear more of this music. I try to stay on top of things, and yet, when I heard Sweet Tooth, the debut album, a solo album from bassist, singer, and composer Mali Obomsawin, I was like, whoa. And I knew that she was in this popular trio, Lula Wiles. I knew that her musicianship had made her kind of a force on the folk, indie pop, jazz, and improvised music scenes. But as she has said, many people didn't know that I also moonlight as a jazz musician. But it's really more than just jazz. And then I wrote a little thing where I said that this album nodded to both the familiarly freeing legacy of Ornette Coleman's quartet, famous quartet, and the lesser-known declarations of independence, the sounds, songs, and ideas of Maine's Wabanaki people. And Mali connects these histories with rare power and ingenuity. She said, my people have had to innovate endlessly to get our stories heard, which to me sounded like a lot of the story of whatever jazz history might be anyway. Mali's also a dedicated community organizer, advocate for indigenous rights, environmental justice, and land back. She's a writer and an educator. In 2020, she co-founded a land trust whose name I don't want to destroy, the first ever Wabanaki Land Trust, which she's executive director of. And after, we'll talk a little bit more about that stuff. But this is Jazz and Social Justice, Indigenous Truth. Please help me welcome Mali Obomsawin and her band.
Do I hear Luluing in New York City? Yeah. Thank you so much for having me and my glorious sextet. We've been on tour for the last week, and we're feeling really good. Thank you. That's Miriam Al-Hajli singing and playing guitar there. She'll be opening our show tomorrow night at Public Records with a cellist. And that was the first movement of my debut album, Sweet Tooth. The first song you heard was in the Wabanaki language, Alnabandwa, and it was written by our ancestors, possibly as early as the 1720s, and it tells the history of our people making our exodus from our traditional territory in the region of Vermont and Lake Champlain in upstate New York, up to our reservation, which is on the other side of the Canadian border in southern Quebec. And that song is actually, it exists in both major and minor, and it's considered our national anthem. And depending on the context and the method of delivery, it's either celebratory or mourning. Because it thanks our ancestors for preserving our nation by moving out of the war zone, but it also mourns the relationship lost or disrupted with our traditional territory. And the second song that you heard is called Lineage, and it's an original composition by me. This album really sought to magnify and celebrate the ancestors whose shoulders I stand on as a musician, growing up in improvised music traditions, and I spent a lot of time looking backwards through our musical history, through our archives, and looking at the history of the, I guess, Wabanaki musicality. And like many other indigenous communities, a lot of our people were stolen, and taken to residential schools. And in those schools, they would discourage any practice of your culture, but they would hand the students marching band instruments and say, you know, your culture's not worth anything, but here are these instruments, and like learn these military chants, learn these hymns. And so as time goes on, you get all of these indigenous musicians with a lot to express, and with marching band or jazz instruments, early jazz instruments, with which to do so. And if you look at my album covers over there on the back cover, there's a picture of the Wabanaki marching band from the early 1900s. So with that said, and with an idea of honoring those whose shoulders we stand on, we're going to do another tune that's new to the band, which I learned from the amazing indigenous band Ulali. It's called Mother. so much. I think that's our 30 minutes. So really happy to have been here. Larry, tell me if I need to keep going, or we want to get to the intellectual stuff. One more? Okay, one more. All right, well. Small stage, many wires. The band Eulali is a huge deal, and you should all check them out. Yeah, if you don't know them already. We're gonna do one more set of tunes, and the first tune you'll hear is a Catholic hymn that was brought to the Wabanaki people in the 1600s from a French Jesuit named Father Joseph Aubry. And he took to learning enough of the Wabanaki language to be able to translate the scripture from French, or Latin actually, into Wabanaki. And he chose a very odd and obscure tale to translate in this next tune. It's called Wawasintonda, and it tells the story of Jesus taking a side quest to hell. I'll say no more. Adventurous guy, Jesus. Fingers are bleeding, literally bleeding.
I think you might have my tape.
Yeah, I see the blood.
Fitting. Religious song, Wawasintonda.
bahay nasa Mataon no. Ni kisisara kewe monjan ulam arsit itakat siawit ni umonja kuila umbin ni wawaje kagaki na on pas goa atuinam kangoje ni yodale odana plakame gasa wagaki na onje kison bait sekian nombah ni kanwa oda cuy pita kino bain ta ulit pe meliki tangsin ni ga pas gua uga ka kinawan ni u monumen hano mek ni udehnan ni atuy lalukaan mo pitaw bagok ma meliwi menahan kejignam itu idam nending no tos woman ni je almo longwe long ni je sang khikdo kwasi no patang yak idam ni atasitan udawa na patang khikdo kwaso mamili biak ni gna je wanas kawan mamil win basak ni atuy tali wanas kawan idam ni meliki guna idam ni ujo kamkong keselomsen ta pitai da meliksano idam ni kisi sang bangsi anana tamia kono dagon kemensano mak idam ni nano gawe ni bilang ta ko kuasi idam ni tamina lebih lalu kan di mana tahu di bina sang bangsi anana di sarabin nama ku barang balda to bawas kasang bawa idam dia dari sana nata bawasa ala bai di sang kawan nana di bebeki dia ita not kawian dina uli wesu petua tuis pita tu sari usa pita suatam kisah
Thank you so much. That's Allison Burek, Allison Phillips. Noah, you already met him. Miriam, you met her. Zach O'Farrell here on the drums. Once again, I'm Mali Obomsawin. Thank you. Stick around. We're going to get brainy.
I don't know about that. Wow. This is the first time I heard that music performed live, so I knew I'd get a little emotional. I have to dance around in the back, and forgive me. That was really beautiful. Please give it up again for these six magnificent musicians. And Mali, don't go anywhere. We're going to set up some chairs and talk. You know, that music obviously, clearly belongs here, and yet it's not in any of these plaques. So we're going to probably talk a little bit about what that plaque might contain and the beauty of those history and tradition, and then also a little bit about the less beautiful truths that we need to confront when we celebrate and honor that tradition and those traditions. I think a good strategy is, you've heard that, then listen to everything we say, and tomorrow night, 9:30, Public Records, listen again and hold everything that Mali and other people say in your head when you listen again. That might be a smart strategy. That might be my strategy. Okay, we're gonna have 4 chairs, right? Yeah, we're gonna end up with 4 chairs. And while we're doing this, I'll let you know that joining us will be Julia Keefe, an acclaimed Native American jazz vocalist, actor, activist, and educator, currently based in New York City. She also has the Indigenous Big Band, and one of its members is, I think, Mali Obomsawin? Right. And we'll also be joined by the woman who's graciously allowed me to do all this stuff, Tracy Hyter-Suffern, who's Executive Director of the National Jazz Museum of Harlem, and is co-chief of Marten Band, Ramapo, Munsee, Lenape Nation. Hopefully I'm right with that. Okay. So let's sit down, and I know it's not as exciting, but trust me, just stick with me. I hope you are, because we're gonna talk.
No, you should be in the middle. You're welcome.
You should be in the middle. That was just so beautiful. And then when you're talking, you know, the way you describe that, that early marching band, I've spent a lot of time in New Orleans. It reminded me of the history of how that and why that music came to be. And then when you describe that piece, that I guess is an anthem that can be major or minor, it reminded me of how Charlie Hayden's Liberation Orchestra used to play Carla Bley's version of America the Beautiful in a minor key every time there was a warmongering Republican president in office. So let's start with music and then deepen things a little bit. And maybe, Mali, Julia, can you talk a little, I mean, obviously you could talk all night about it, but can you talk a little bit about how you got immersed in and learned the tradition of your native people, and how you got immersed in and learned the other traditions that you practice, and obviously the tradition from which your bass playing springs?
Me first, bass playing. Wow, that was like so many questions in one question.
Just dive in.
All right. Well, my dad is Wabanaki, citizen of Odanak First Nation, and he is a musician. He's a blues musician, and he also grew up in the 70s, so he plays a lot of rock and roll. And yes, rock and roll till he dies. That's my dad. And so I grew up wanting to be in his band, and he already played guitar, and my brothers play drums. And I feel like there's an unnecessary amount of reverb for this happening right now. So that, thank you. So that's how I started playing music. But I also grew up hearing a lot of songs, powwow songs, ceremony songs, sung by the Wabanaki people. While I'm enrolled in my community that's north of the border, I grew up in western Maine, south of the border, a lot closer with our relatives at Penobscot Nation. And so they're very closely related culturally, linguistically. We have all the same songs, and that's where I learned.
And when you learned those songs, the powwow songs, ceremonial songs, was that songs you learned from family in your community and not in, from a formal repertoire?
Yeah, it's an oral tradition.
Right.
Absolutely.
And a social.
Communal tradition, social tradition, absolutely. And dancing is always involved.
So I was correct then.
Yes.
Okay. And Julia, how did you come to the things that you end up combining in your music?
Sure. Well, first of all, hi everybody. I'm Julia. Some random lady sitting up here in front of you all. Thanks for having me. Friend of this one. So I'm a jazz vocalist and band leader. Molly and I are in my all Indigenous big band, the Julia Keefe Indigenous big band. I would have to say that I feel like both the Western tradition and the cultural practices and music of the Nimipu people, the Nez Perce people, really came about at the same time. So I grew up on my tribe's reservation in Kamiah, Idaho, which is like a really tiny lumber community. There's maybe 1,000 people in this town. Mm-hmm. And, learning songs in church. The Presbyterians really came through the Pacific Northwest, and so the Nimipu people ended up, converting to Presbyterianism. And so I learned a lot about Western music in the church, but I also learned a lot about my native language in the church, because all of those hymns were translated into Nimipu Timt, which is the language, and that was part of the indoctrination of the Nimipu people. And but it inadvertently became a way to preserve the language, because there was such a systemic approach to erasing that cultural practice of language through Indian boarding schools. So as I was growing up, I was learning my language and learning music in church, and then of course going to powwows and going to cultural celebrations and ceremonies. I actually got into jazz as a 4-year-old because my mom had a CD of Billie Holiday's greatest hits from the Decca recordings. Mm-hmm. And the tune No More got stuck in my brain as a 4-year-old, and so I grew up with Billie Holiday sort of haunting my subconscious. And it wasn't until we moved off our reservation to Spokane, Washington, and I started studying music in a formal setting that I actually was introduced to jazz in a formal way. So that's all I have to say about that.
Tracy, can you talk a little bit about your own background and lineage and how it affected or how it entered your consciousness?
Sure. First, I want to say that we're all here on Turtle Island, and so depending on who you're speaking to, either Manhattan is Turtle Island, North America is Turtle Island, or the planet is Turtle Island. So once again, welcome home. I didn't have any of those experiences. I begin the story in a different place each time. Larry's asked me to be brief. Mm-hmm. But I will say to you, and I love to tell stories, so I can go on forever. But I will say to you that my grandparents escaped the Ramapo Mountains in the 1920s, where people were being hunted as deer. And during Jim Crow, pretended to be colored until they died. My grandfather died in 1986. My grandmother died in 1991. And they would never admit to being Native people. And so I grew up thinking that my father and my grandparents were fair-skinned, straight-haired black people, because we come in those colors too. when I was in college, I took a folklore class, and the assignment over spring break was to speak to the oldest person I knew, who was my grandfather. And I started asking him a lot of questions, and for the first time in my life, and I was his favorite. He's not here, so I can say that. He had never raised his voice at me. He started screaming at me. And my father and my cousin brought me outside and told me the truth about who we were. And I was 21 years old, and that's how I found out.
You know, if you look into, quote unquote, the jazz history that this museum maybe is about, you know, if you look into lineages from Charlie Parker to Henry Threadgill and everyone in between, there are Native American roots. I mean, if you look into the history of jazz, you better know about Haiti. There's a lot of history that maybe we need to learn. And it wasn't until I heard, I think it was the 80s, maybe it was the 90s, Don Pullen, the great pianist, had an album called Sacred Common Ground. And it was a collaboration of the Chief Cliff Singers and Pullen's African-Brazilian connection. And it just hit me. First of all, it was beautiful, but it really hit me hard that just the truth of how big and how unified this was. And it really pisses me off when people would talk about Randy Weston playing Moroccan musicians and say he's collaborating and creating a fusion. So I would say that it would be a good idea for everyone here to read a piece that Mali wrote. It's on the National Performance Network website called Turning Our Insides Out, on presenting indigeneity, self-commodification, and the white gaze, which I found to be really informative and also really powerful. And there are so many things I would quote, but I know, Mali, at one point you wrote, as a Native person, I've always romanticized the potential of the stage to change minds. Real Native people stories are generally, and I'm glad Julia used that word erased in our popular culture. So how and when did the pieces of the strands that come together in your music come together?
So, yeah, like Larry mentioned, I got my start playing folk, traditional fiddle music, roots music, particularly in Maine, where there's a lot of music coming down from Acadia, so Quebecois, Acadian music, Cape Breton music. I'm sure I'm forgetting some. But fiddle music, fiddle tunes, and I grew up really loving that. There's amazing melodies, amazing rhythms, amazing diversity in those folk traditions, and I also started playing jazz in high school, really going to the Maine jazz camp, and the first songs that I played were Ornette Coleman tunes, because that's a very rad camp. That's up there. I think it's very healthy for young jazz musicians to start with free jazz. And yeah, and at a certain point, I started touring with a band called Lula Wiles, and we played songs that we wrote. We played traditional, like Appalachian-inspired or Appalachian-derived songs, and I got jaded with the scene of that, particularly the audiences, and for a lot of you will probably presume accurately that audiences for that kind of folk music tend to be elder white folks who straddle the line between nice liberal folks and like super conservative nice liberal folks. These are scare quotes. And and sorry, and conservative folks who want to hear some honky tonk music and real American music, but only when white people play the banjo, folks.
And it's not an African instrument either.
No, right. Certainly not. And that was a hard scene to navigate. And at a certain point, I started writing songs that were more derived from my personal experience. I had a song called Good Old American Values that kind of got me started in that, and really started wanting to talk about these things from stage, and was not impressed with the response or the reception, I guess, that I got, and my band eventually split up over the pandemic. But during my studies at Dartmouth College, I didn't raise my hand earlier, I was hiding. I had studied with a mentor named Taylor Hobynum, amazing cornet player and improviser and just beautiful person, and he helped me start composing in this tradition, in the free jazz or improvised black creative music tradition, and he mentored me, still does, and encouraged me to put together an album, and kind of kicked me out of the nest and said, go do it, and now we're doing it.
And was the affinity between these two traditions, or the whatever traditions, was it natural within you from like when I heard Thelonious Monk's music played by Jerry Gonzalez, Rumba Para Monk, it was, okay, he didn't set that to clave. The clave was in there.
Right.
He just was it,
Right.
was that
Yes.
affinity really clear within you?
Yes, that's a great point and question. You know, I think that my upbringing in oral traditions and in folk music translates very easily into jazz music, and I think same with the traditional native songs as well. You know, for obvious reasons of shared origins in the church, in multiracial communities coming together and making sounds, and I think that because I have followed and been really excited about certain jazz musicians, Mingus for obvious reasons, Don Cherry, you know, all these folks who really pushed to acknowledge that jazz music is folk music. I think those things came together easily because others have done that before. I'm not the first.
And there's also, if you listen to powwow music, there is that underlying triplet subdivision and that sense of swing, which I think is really hip, that like so many influential, you know, musicians in the evolution of jazz, you know, have an indigenous background. And, you know, it can we go back and say that like the triplet subdivision of traditional American like native music came from the African tradition, or is this like is that triplet subdivision a bigger sense of native with a lowercase n? Like it is so deeply embedded in us as indigenous people of the earth, that triplet subdivision. You know, that's obviously something that we can't go back and listen to recordings. We can't really analyze it in that way, but you know, my drawing to jazz and the marriage of like native music or native stories and jazz, like that, I didn't realize it until much later, because I was always told that these were two separate things.
Yes.
Like,
Well, no, this is a whole new.
I know, I just
Whole
wandered
new
down
rabbit
a totally
hole.
different route.
No, this is a rabbit hole I'm going to go into for a long. But are you saying so that music and that drum tradition is polyrhythmic?
Yeah.
That's what, okay.
Yeah,
Certainly.
absolutely.
And so when I talked to the singers that work with Don Pullen, I started talking about the drum and powwow music. They corrected me and said, it's the voice leads the drum and not the other way around. Would that?
Never thought about it that
I
way.
never thought of it that way either. I feel like
I think it depends.
I think it depends. Yeah, it
Okay.
also depends
Sometimes.
on you know, where the drum group comes from,
Right.
because you know,
Yeah.
we want to talk about sort of the erasure of natives in popular culture. It really is that sort of that monolithic view perpetuated by Hollywood
Right.
of like what it is to be native, right? And so, yeah, there's one kind of being native, and it's a plains native on an Appaloosa pony in like full buckskin
Right.
and
Getting shot at.
and yes, getting shot at because they're the bad guys, right? But I think the same can come from, you know, what is traditional Native music? It is this one specific sound. But if you listen to, you know, the music of different groups from different parts of the U.S. and Canada, it's a very distinctly different sound. It's a distinct way of singing. It's a distinct way of drumming. You know, we're not monolithic.
Agreed. And I think also, you know, if you think about powwow drumming as a good example, powwow was a Western tradition that now everybody does, basically. It's not, it's not like an ancient tradition for us Eastern natives or Northern, you know, you go up to Alaska and you got Yupik and Inupiaq people, Inuit people, and that's definitely not what they do. But there is some really cool stuff that we can learn from powwow music, in that it is like now like a very like a way of like lots of Native folks sharing those musical traditions, and kind of a, hate to say the word melting pot, but you know, in the rhythmic context for powwow drumming, the drum and the vocal are actually almost sometimes unrelated. You know, there's like 4 to 8 several people drumming around one big drum, and that's constant, that is unwavering, that's the heartbeat, and then the vocal goes wherever it wants to rhythmically on top of that, and really floats on top and interplays across bar lines, you know, and that's something that's distinctive that people have identified about Mildred Bailey's singing, Coeur d'Alene, right? And I think a really playful melodic element in jazz music, between the heartbeat and the kind of freer melody, and
And in blues, right?
Yeah.
Blues. I mean, I know, talking with like Oludara or Cassandra Wilson, who are from Mississippi, they talked about that a lot. But well, there's the reason why they go over the bar lines is the way they do is that tradition. I'm so glad you brought up that point about that diversity and multiplicity, because, like, yeah, people talk about Congo Square in New Orleans, and they say African, or they might say West African, but there were a lot of different languages. Some of them were Kikongo, some of them, and it's a common thing we do. What else, other than, we talked a little bit about musical elements, but you know, every musical culture that's not the ones that are popularized here also have their set of values or function, as opposed to just performance. And for me, one interesting thing about jazz tradition is it really straddles performing, but other things that are either ritual or communal. Can any of you talk about the kind of values or context for that culture?
What immediately comes to mind for me is these two values, the value of collectivity and the value of celebrating the uniqueness of the individual. And this is so central to jazz playing, right? You have the collective, and then you give the moment to celebrate the unique offering that that one person at a time exclusively can do, you know, inimitable, right? And that's, we think of all these amazing soloists, and that feels so, I'm sure that's present in other cultures, but that feels so native to me in how we think about the interwoven responsibilities and roles in our communities, and how we celebrate each other in that way.
Yeah.
It's also the value of just the ritual itself. You know, the ritual of coming together. The first time you ever go to a powwow, you experience that feeling of just being surrounded by so many people who have something in common with you that you didn't even know you had in common with other people. And so that's one of the purposes that the drum serves. What you're talking about, this bringing together of people who don't know each other but are connected on a very spiritual level. And that connection is highlighted, it's elevated by the drum.
When you talk about that prized individuality, is improvisation an important element of this tradition in and of itself?
Yeah, no, I definitely think that improvisation plays a huge part, because the thing about improvisation is that it's it shouldn't be masturbatory. It's about getting deeper, right? Like you're getting deeper into the music, you're getting deeper into the practice, you're getting deeper into the prayer. And I think that's one of those beautiful things that translates from jazz and the native, American Indian, Alaska Native, First Nations, indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, that tradition, that, music served as lifting up prayers. And so often our prayers were also our stories to honor Creator and to honor our ancestors, but also to honor the next generation. But so much of it was about getting deeper and making it more than just making noise or pretty sounds. And I think that's one of the many things that I love about Mali's music is that like it is a conversation that is getting deeper, and it's that beautiful marriage of that native tradition and the jazz tradition of music as prayer.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's very nice. Two things come to mind. First, that I think this balance between collectivity and individuality and how it's expressed is definitely present in Indigenous African tradition, well, West African specifically, and what I've observed from like dancing rituals, probably musical as well, but like you think about the drumming groups and the communal festivities, right? And you have the collective happening, and then also people come up and like dance solo, right? And pass that around. And so I think maybe that's a way that many indigenous cultures from around the world have learned to honor each other. And the other thing that comes to mind is... Oh my gosh, it was the main thing that I wanted to say. Oh no. Well,
It'll come back.
It'll come
It'll
back,
come back.
and then you could
We'll
shout
get
it
it.
out, no matter what else we're saying. Many years ago, I edited what was called a world music magazine. In the days when David Byrne and Paul Simon were explorers out in the world, bringing us back things. And what could be more colonial or demeaning than even just the term world music?
It's like a museum of sounds, right?
It's like a
We're just
museum sound, and they're all other.
collecting
But-
all the equities
But
of other
well, I
nations.
did, and then but I was editing this thing and trying to do a good job, and we did one issue on Native American music, and I really did realize that this is the most other of the world musics that you could present to an American audience. They know more about Chinese music. They know more about Hindustani music. They know, which is just an erasure.
Yeah.
Have in your work, in creating music out of what you've inspired by what you just talked about, and Tracy, in your work here, have those experiences changed how you experience your own Native identity? Have they
The experiences
of doing this work here?
hasn't changed it. Not for me. My Native identity, as I said, began for me as an adult. But what it has done is what I've done my whole life, and that is it has positioned me to insist on certain things. So what that has meant with Native American music is there is an insistence that Native American music and jazz music are relatives. There's that insistence, and sometimes it's met with resistance. And so there's this constant sort of teaching for me, even when I'm wrong, wrong and strong, but I'm making a point that there is a connection between Native Americans and Africans that go back as far as the Underground Railroad, if not farther, where escaped enslaved people found refuge sometimes. and sometimes the opposite, but refuge in Native American communities. And there was a natural, if not literal, certainly a figurative marriage of cultures that was carried forward and continues to be carried forward. There's an insistence here of commonality. So the stories I know about both sides of my family I know because of oral tradition, right? And that's common to all indigenous cultures, not just African cultures and not just Native American cultures. And so for me, in the work here, there is an insistence that guides us away from that monolith that you talked about. And an insistence that just like jazz and just like any other kind of music, there is not one exactly what you're saying. There's not one kind of Native American music, and it is related to jazz. And if we don't know it immediately, it is our responsibility to find it.
Have your, Julia and Mali, have in the creation and performing and experiencing your own music, has that changed your idea of your Native identity over time? Has it made you realize things that maybe you wouldn't have?
I feel, well, like I said earlier, for the longest time, I kept jazz and Native separate.
Right.
Because oftentimes when I would say I'm a Native American jazz vocalist, people would be like, what do you mean by that? And it was a problem somehow for some people. And so being the recovering people pleaser that I am, I decided to make them more comfortable by not being Native anymore.
Right.
I was ethnically ambiguous, and that's fine. But I guess as time has gone on, I've gotten a little more angry about it. And I know we're in a museum, but it's a jazz museum. A little more just sort of like, fuck you. You can be upset with my indigeneity. That's not my problem. That's a you problem. I'm not gonna fix that. And so I guess I've become a little more brazen. I think my identity hasn't changed, but I'm a little more unapologetic about it because I don't want to be a culture fit anymore. I know that I'm a culture add.
Nice. I'm your hype girl.
Throw my microphone down, except for I'm not going to.
I think because I came up in a white folk Americana world, I kind of just like assumed that jazz would be better. And so far, very true for in my experience. But that was my like hypothesis when I was like, maybe I'll shift. And it's been, and I'm lucky, very lucky to have a lot of mentors who really emphasize that jazz is a place for all of our individual experiences, and especially the oral tradition and the shared history, and even I have some Indigenous jazz musician mentors, including like my peer mentors like Julia and Delbert Anderson, but also the elder Bill Cole, who wrote a very famous book about John Coltrane, which you've probably all read, and who is Black and Indigenous. And I think, and his whole philosophy is about, celebrating the oral tradition and these common roots, right? And so I felt really validated in this world in that way, and just kind of just supported, and that's not to say that bigotry and ignorance don't exist. And even, you know, especially in the music industry, I think people hear, like Julia's saying, people hear Native American or First Nation, and they think that they know exactly what that's about. And as recently as 2 months ago, you know, we were at the APAP conference, and I had to give my elevator pitch to this presenter. I was like, yeah, you know, I lead a jazz band, you know, with like First Nations influence. And he's like, oh yeah, First Nations, yeah, we got those down where I'm from. End of conversation. And this is a presenter that like could have been hosting my band.
Right.
But he's like, oh, I know what that's about, and I know I'm not into it, so bye.
Well, also, isn't it bananas that oftentimes when we're talking to presenters and like pitching ourselves as Indigenous jazz musicians, there's always that like, oh, we can't make money off of you, so
Right,
pass. And
right.
it's like,
Right.
that's bananas to me,
Right.
because again, it's a culture ad, and it's not like ticking off your diversity, equity, and inclusion thing when you have someone like Molly who's presenting her music that's killing, and it sells out shows all the time. Like, you're not doing her a favor by booking her. You're investing in something that's on the upward trajectory. And I feel like that's just, again, like, I get so mad, and I...
Julia is my booking agent.
It's true.
Right.
And I'm not
Kind
a
of.
booking agent, but I'm acting as one, and it just drives me nuts because it doesn't matter if it's Indigenous free jazz or me, I'm straight ahead jazz vocalist, but because I'm Native American, oh, it must be world music, and therefore we're not going to
Right,
book you.
right.
And, you know, the sort of having to qualify it and justify it with every fucking beat of your heart until the cows come home and people still just pass. They're not interested.
I'm glad you're saying that, because, you know, there's ways to be in the music industry where you focus on the word industry. There's ways of being in the music industry where you focus on the word music. And that's why I pointed out, you know, someone as giant and famous as Randy Weston, if he plays with Moroccan musicians, he's doing a crossover act. I mean, it's just insulting. It's insulting, but it also misses the point of we're telling stories and we're dealing with ancestors while innovating. Like, that's what this is about. That's why you'd have this place, right? So I do get that. I know that they are related, they're not separate things, but I know that all three of you are involved in active. Now, when I was growing up in Brooklyn, yeah, all I learned was the Plains Indian falling off the horse when he was shot. Maybe, if you're old enough to remember, the chief with a tear rolling, and that's environmentalism.
He wasn't even native.
No,
That was Sicilian.
Yeah.
Everything about
They
that.
all were Sicilian.
Everything about that was wrong. But can you talk and I grew up ignorant even of the idea that these are nations and we have treaties. Like, I didn't know a simple fact about the political, historical structure of my country. Can you talk a little bit about the activism that you do and what you mean by a land trust, what you mean by land back, what it really means to deal with environment? Pick up wherever you want to, but what should we know? What should we be involved in? What should we be aware of?
Man,
I know, it's
y'all
just
better get comfortable.
exactly.
Do you want to talk? Do you want me to talk? What do you want to say?
And I do want to say that this whole, like, tomorrow night you go hear more of the music. This conversation is meant like, okay, take this out and do your own research and have your own conversation. This is just a spark.
I'll start.
Yes.
Okay. So 2 things that come to mind. One is missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. Right. So Native people are among the highest, if not the highest, unreported missing and murdered group in the country. So that's one issue. Our tribe is creating an embassy to the UN and have asked me to create what we're calling a women's desk, to focus specifically on this issue. Another is the understanding that most tribes in the United States, most nations, are not federally recognized, and mine is one of them. And so the deep embedded racism around that, some of it is obvious, but the other, for example, in the case of our tribe, has meant that we have had to prove our blood quantum, right? So, exactly. So
It's like 1920.
it's like 1820. So where for the black community, it has meant one drop of blood makes you black.
Wow.
For the Native community, it's prove you have a drop of Native blood, because it is tied to things like treaties and reparations and rights. So while the Ramapo, Munsee, Lenape Nation has state recognition in New Jersey, not only don't we have, we straddle the New York-New Jersey border, so Spring Valley, Mahwah, the Ramapo Mountain area. We do not have recognition in New York, and we do not have federal recognition. And one of the weapons the federal government has used to make sure that we don't get federal recognition is they describe us as black people mixed with Native, as opposed to Native people mixed with black blood. And I was lucky enough to have my grandparents alive when I had to prove our Native blood. And so the way you do that is you fill out an ancestral chart. And for every tribe, it's different. Every nation, it's different. For us, we had to go as far back as my grandparents' great-grandparents. And so you're filling out names, you're filling out places of birth, you're filling out birth dates before such a thing as a birth certificate even existed. So those are two.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thank you for that.
I do land back work, which is based on the understanding that we all are on stolen land, and it's time to flip that script back to the way it should be. So I organize in Maine with my fellow Wabanaki people, and I, with them, founded a land trust in 2020 because it's, believe it or not, really hard to pull off transitions of lands to Native people, particularly Native tribes, nations with governments in Maine because of a court case in 1980, which even amongst the 575-ish federally recognized tribes, which the tribes in Maine are, there are hurdles that the other federally recognized tribes do not have to cross in getting land back into tribal ownership. And so in Maine, we decided, we need another way of getting land back and holding land collectively, communally, and we decided to found a land trust in order to do that. So it's intertribal, Wabanaki intertribal. Like I said, my tribe is recognized north of the border in Canada, but our traditional territory includes all of Western Maine, and so it's almost at least philosophically cross-border, although legally we are not allowed to do that yet. So I do that, and but another big part of the organizing work that we do through Obamsawin Land Trust and just as Indigenous organizers in our homeland is we act on predicated on the idea that as Indigenous people who have the luxury of being in our homeland, even through all we suffer, it's our responsibility to welcome in those displaced relatives who have been forced into diaspora from their traditional homelands. So we work a lot building solidarity with Black and Brown communities in our homeland to try to, put these difficult conversations on the table of, how do reparations for non-Native Black folks and land back and, resources for Native people, how do these intersect, and how do we balance and really move this justice movement of solidarity and mutual acknowledgement and mutual uplifting forward. So we do that through food work, food sovereignty. We do that through mutual aid. We do that through sharing our ceremonies with our Black and brown relatives. Yeah, that's some of what we do.
I just want to thank you for bringing up missing and murdered Indigenous people. So my day job is actually working in American Indian and Alaska Native public health issues. And a big thing that I worked on was actually for the Violence Against Women Act, transcribing the testimonies of women and girls throughout Indian country. And Indigenous women suffer the highest rates of domestic and sexual violence than any other demographic. And there are jurisdictional loopholes on reservations that allow non-Native perpetrators of violence to go without any sort of punishment, because reservations are technically federally run, but it happens within a state. Tribal courts can't prosecute these non-Native offenders because they're not Native and it's biased. Therefore, but the state can't do anything because it's on federal land. So people get away with perpetuating violence. And what is incredibly disheartening is that oftentimes these perpetrators of domestic and sexual violence know that. Oftentimes when people start digging for oil and all that other shit, they always put it close to Native reservations. It's not, that's not an accident. Like oftentimes, yes, oil fields are there on Indigenous land, on Native reservations, but also all of these man camps are set up around these sites, and that's when Indigenous women go missing, and Indigenous bodies are found. And there is a direct correlation. So the pass of the Willow Project in Alaska is a huge, huge detrimental act that was passed that allowed the mining of thousands upon thousands upon thousands of pristine wildlife in Alaska. And it means more man camps are going to go up around these Native villages that are already incredibly, incredibly isolated, because Alaska is huge and it's hard to get support up to Alaska. The people, the Native Alaskan villages are already preparing for it because the Biden administration approved this project. This is one of the issues that we're dealing with today. Another thing that we're dealing with is the Indian Child Welfare Act, which also ties into missing and murdered Indigenous people. The Indian Child Welfare Act was passed so that we wouldn't have Indian boarding schools again. It was so that when a Native child has to be taken from their parents because of, any sort of violence or alcoholism or anything like that, which again is very pervasive in Indian country because of these systemic institutions that are in place to disenfranchise people of color. Thank you, United States of America. These children are removed from their parents, but the Indian Child Welfare Act makes it mandatory that those children grow up within their people. They can't go to a non-Native family. Because in the 1950s, you could purchase an Indian child for $10. Shit like that is part of our history. And the Indian Child Welfare Act is being confronted and being challenged by the US Supreme Court. We're gonna hear about it this summer. And this is a huge, huge threat to tribal sovereignty. We need people to speak out on these issues because, like I said, there is a system in place that very much drowns out Indigenous voices, sort of sweeps it to the side. All the more reason for allies of Indigenous issues, which I think also touch so many other races in the US of A. All the more reason for all of us to speak up and speak out and challenge those who are challenging Indigenous sovereignty in the US.
Thank you for spelling, at least drawing us into and sketching those issues. And yeah, I'm worried. That's another one of the things I'm worried about coming before this particular court. Are there, for people, and there are people streaming here too, who want to know more about these issues or maybe get involved, is there anywhere good to direct their attention?
I would, there are some really fantastic nonprofit organizations that not only provide details and more information about these specific issues, but they provide information about issues all over Indian country, including, you know, natives in pop culture now. Following Illuminative, they provide a lot of information about these issues, as well as Indian Collective, NDN Collective. Gosh, there are so many other like amazing.
Native American Rights Fund.
Native American Rights Fund. Indigenous Women Rising.
Lakota Law Project. Earth Justice. There's something. Earth.
Just go to my Instagram and look up everyone I follow.
I want to, probably don't have that much time, and I want to invite a couple of questions, but I need to ask, just because people seem to throw around climate change, sustainability, environmentalism in ways that are meant as serious, but I think a lot of times those people don't understand the change in mindset that would be needed to actually deal with those issues. So when you talk about and write about environmental justice, what do you mean? We need to know.
So for tens of thousands of years, Indigenous peoples have been developing very sophisticated scientific knowledges and practices of land caretaking, maximizing biodiversity, literally transforming our landscapes to be paradises, ecological paradises for all species. Tens of thousands of years, people. And many of us still have that knowledge, or we are able to reach backwards through our language and through what has persisted of our cultures to put these pieces back together with the help of Western knowledge. And so I firmly believe, and many of us do, that the land back movement, returning land, stolen land to Indigenous people, protects land. It's a way to maximize biodiversity and fight climate change using the tool of tribal sovereignty, right? This is supporting tribal sovereignty, which is this is a racial justice issue, but it also is a solution to the environmental crisis that we are in. So that is what I advocate for, and the nucleus of the land back movement. It's not just because we want to be right, you know? It's because we care about the land so much, and our ancestors were literally doing science for tens of thousands of years before Western scientists knew anything about anything, you know? But this is built into our cultures. These scientific practices are built into the way that we exist, and the way that we bring up our youth. So, land back.
Thank you. And no, I'm really glad we talked about that. And I'm, you know, when I read about new strategies, and maybe there's a Norwegian or Swedish scientist involved. I'm always a little bit skeptical about, well, how come not even steal the science,
Yeah.
but don't even go there.
We don't even need new technologies.
No.
We need ancient knowledge.
Right.
And to be fair, it's not just Native Americans, right? Indigenous people on every continent.
On every continent.
Have this knowledge. And because they've been there forever, they know that land. They know what needs to happen in that particular place.
And the mindset that allowed them to gain that knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have a question for our three panelists? Go ahead.
One on the political side. There's two threads you mentioned on the social justice issue. One is recognition, so the confronting the erasure of the culture. The other is issues of economic justice, access to wealth, equal access to wealth. And I wonder how these two elements work in your music. Which one feels
Music?
well? Yeah, I mean, in the
Yeah.
inspiration of your music. And the other on musical references is the music remind me a lot of some explorations of South American jazz musicians, so Gato Barbieris, Flying Dutchman, and Impulse Records, and then Egberto Gismonti's work which play with the language of jazz but have less of the Afro percussion element. So I wonder whether any of the references are in there beyond the ones you mentioned, Don Cherry or Don Pullen or Thelonious Monk.
Wow, two big questions. I guess I'll say first that I don't know if recognition or economic policy plays necessarily a role in my music. It's, I live my song, so my organizing, my activism is focused on these things, and I'm sure it is part of the atmosphere where I'm creating, but I really just try to lean into the tradition of sharing and of improvising and bringing in as much of what I have learned of my culture into what I have learned as a bassist, as a musician. And I think I also, I have a lot of musical influences, but I really can't take that much credit for a lot of what my bandmates play, and that's a big part of my philosophy as a composer, is really allowing all of the individuals in my collective to bring their backgrounds and everything they've ever listened to, and I really try to maximize and encourage them to bring that. And before every show lately, I'm telling them to find whatever it is that they need to play to, and when we recorded the album, I was encouraging that. We all have such diverse stories of our ancestors being colonized, and our roles, our ancestors' experiences, and I tell them to bring that, and I hope I would be the most honored if my music was a vessel for those experiences to be let out and those ancestors to be freed.
Do we have another quick question? Good, because we really don't have the time. I do want to. Uh-oh, Zach, forget it, man. You can't have. Oh.
It's so cool.
There is incredible merch. The LP, the back cover of the LP alone.
Zach is selling it.
Zach is selling it. Zach is his own color. I wouldn't give that man any cash if I were you. No, I do. I mean, I love your music, Mali, but then once for what it sounds like, but it also just immediately, for me, it does a lot of what the people you talked about, Ornette, Mingus, do. It's the opposite of fundamentalism, and it allows you to hold beautiful and unpleasant truths together, and we're smart enough and deep enough to actually hold those two together at the same time and not explode. So the assignment is to read turning our insides out on presenting indigeneity, self-commodification, and the white gaze on the National Performance Network website that Mali, and I'm just saying that because I'm a writer, and that's a good, strong piece of writing on some stuff that I needed to understand better.
Thank you.
Then tomorrow night, 9:30, Public Records in Brooklyn. You can hear more, not just what we did here, but more. And I'm so glad we did that other piece because I love that piece. Please, so yeah, this is meant as a spark. Please take these thoughts and these sounds and go forth. Thank you. So please help me thank these three women for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for coming to hear live music and to hear people talk about ideas.